If you wanted to hide your treasure, why would you resort to tattered pieces of paper, crudely drawn landmarks, and X marks the spot? If you wanted to make sure that you could find your hoard again but still keep it safe from anyone who wanted to find it, wouldn't you think your way through it a little more? Isn't there more to treasure maps than you may think at first? Welcome, adventurers, to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and today we'll be discussing creating treasure maps for your fantasy worlds. We also have a couple of other topics today, as well as going into how you can create your own treasure maps and the step-by-step guide for that. I'll also have a quick rundown on the creation of this watercolor map, as opposed to my normal inked style, and the pros and cons of this method. And this is the first week of our new linked format, which I'll talk about later. But for now, let's talk treasure maps. Sometimes nothing scratches an itch quite like a big red cross marked on a map, but let's take it a little further, as we generally do here at the Red Quills. Today, we're going to paint a complex picture of the sea floor, give an idea of trade routes, ambush points, protected areas, and add in some notes from the pirate who owns the map, leading not only to those excellent pirating spots, but also to his treasure. And when we're done, you'll be able to use a map like this in your own campaigns as both navigational chart and treasure map. So, let's get started. As always, we'll begin with a blank page, and I'll start by creating a quick sketch of the landmasses. Because we're not working with buildings or dungeons, it's not strictly necessary to do a sketch, but I'd recommend it when working with watercolors, so that you don't have to keep the whole picture in mind as you're working the details, and you can focus on specific parts as you get to them. Then we'll take out our watercolors and begin to paint. I wet the area that I want to paint first, not too much, just enough to get a sheen on the paper, and then add in the paint. Because I'm painting the sea floor here, I can get away with some mismatched areas, some darkness and some light, as that will just add to the overall effect. I'd like to address the comments that I've had recently about how long it would take for different styles and different sizes of maps. I've stated before that I allocated about 7 to 8 hours for the maps that I work on here, and due to the fact that it's all in one long slot, it means that you can really tell that I'm flagging by the end. But there's a lot of different ways that you can cut that time down in your own map making, the easiest of which is to work on smaller scales. I've got an A2 240 GSM piece of paper here. It's thick enough for watercolors. Note that if you're working with watercolors for the first time, you'll need thicker paper, otherwise you won't get the same effects and it'll be a mess. And honestly, A2 is bloody enormous. You can just as easily work on a smaller sized paper. It's not exactly a linear relationship. I wouldn't say that it takes half the time for an A3 piece of paper or a quarter of the time for an A4 piece of paper. But if you were to do this on an A4 piece of paper, taking your time to make sure you got the details in, that would only probably take you about 3 hours or so. In the near future, I'll be coming out with a video about doing maps in different sizes and different styles to save time, so keep your eyes open for that. Now let's talk a little more about this map. What I'm doing for this map is a little more world building than would normally go into a simple treasure map. The idea is quite simple. The average pirate has neither the artistic skills, the tools, or the knowledge to create an accurate map. They would be forced to create something simplistic and rough, which may impact on the ability to read the thing. So what a moderately intelligent pirate will do is find a map that has been plundered from a merchant vessel and use that as the basis for the notes that they will use to mark out their treasure. And that's what I'm doing. We'll make an official nautical map that's been stolen and written on by a pirate to mark out their treasure. Clever, eh? Which is why we're going to all this effort for details. Now, I personally don't tend to watercolor my maps very often. The last few videos that I've come out with have had a bit of it. Mainly illustrations or to highlight areas, but nothing over the top. But given some of the responses that I've had to recent maps, I thought that I would take this opportunity to see how worthwhile it was to watercolor more often. I'm also aware that while I go to great efforts to hand illustrate all of these maps, there are plenty of digital painting apps that are specifically built to help people create their own fantasy worlds, and they are an option. Far be it from me to say that they aren't. No gatekeeping here, maps are for everyone. But there is a certain limitation that you'll encounter in any creative method that doesn't let you use your own hands. Overall, I'm enjoying this watercolor. It's a little time consuming, it's a little ostentatious, if I'm being honest. But it adds a texture to the world that cannot be duplicated by ink, and I enjoy that. I'll always return to ink as being the best medium for a map. It's quick, it's easy to read, it can make detailed work like nothing else, and it's very accessible for everyone. Watercoloring has a good effect, but it does take a fair amount of skill. Even I'm not sure I'm getting the most out of using it here, and it can make any mistakes very messy. Alright, we've had a brief chat about the mediums and the techniques so far. In a little while I'll finish up the watercolors and move to using inks. It's the same method as my usual maps, thicker black lines for the coasts and a 0.3mm coloured for the symbols and the terrain. There are fine liners that do well on watercolors, but to make it easy to read, I'm keeping the colours off of the paint with the exception of the coastline and a few blue labels. There's another thing that I'm trying here, which is when I inked in the mountain ranges, I used a 0.3mm black fine liner pen, one of my art liners that I normally use, which is slightly water soluble, which is generally a bad thing if you're using it on watercolors. But what I'm doing is I'm going to use a very lightly dampened brush on those mountain ranges to slick the ink out and use the ink itself to shade the mountains. Overall, it worked fairly well. I need to go over the mountains again after they're finished, as they lost a little bit of their cohesiveness, but I think it works quite nicely. If you're not experienced with watercolors, this is perhaps an option for you. Now, let's discuss what's actually in the map. In the past, we've created realm maps aplenty, each focusing on different attributes and information loads. For instance, our trade maps tutorial went into how to denote the cost of passage by sea or the tolls on bridges, and our cultural map talked about establishing different spheres of influence and methods of governance. This map, given that it's a merchant's map stolen by a pirate, will more heavily feature the trade map information, but let's not overburden it with too much information at this point. We'll put enough on there to do some world building and be useful, and then extrapolate from there, why don't we? Given that this map is a map for the sailing merchant, it obviously looks most closely at the nautical features of the Gold Hunter Sea. The fact that the sea takes up a solid 3/4 of this map should be fairly indicative, but let's be clear. So, to that end, I as a map maker am going to draw a quick outline of where I want the coastlines to go and then run through a list of various natural landmarks that would be significant to firstly the seagoing merchant and secondly the opportunistic pirate. A sea captain will always view the coastline through the lens of safety or peril. A deep, secluded cove is generally safe, while an open beach littered with rocks is dangerous. Everything becomes about how you can move your ship through the area with the least amount of fuss. Ships are heavily at the mercy of the tides, the weather, and practically everything else, particularly before the invention of the engine. Your sails, anchor, and keel are crucial to your ability to voyage, but all extremely fragile in their own ways. So when you look at your own coastline, to add some detail in, consider adding the following points of secluded coves versus open beaches, gentle coastlines versus dense islands, deep straits versus reefs, and undersea plateaus versus trenches. These natural details, in addition to the ones that you normally add to land-based maps, will give you plenty to work on. There's a rule of thumb that I tend to use for both maps and life in general that's particularly applicable here. Complexity is achieved by layering simplicity. Complexity is great in a map. It's the je ne sais quoi that makes the reader feel as though they're looking at something that really could be several hundred miles across. Convolution is different, and the difference is that complex things can be broken down into simple and distinct lines. For instance, when you're making a nautical map, you want to add as much detail as possible. You want to create obstacles for your heroes as they're sailing through, rather than stringing all of these complications together and making them all work on the same level. Consider each addition as a different layer. On the most basic level is the navigational obstacle, the ones that affect everyone that takes to a boat. The currents, the coastlines, the rocks and the reefs, that's the first layer. Then you make the second layer, the territorial obstacles. The land realms have their own slices of the seas, their own rules that they try to impose within the reach of their ports. Tariffs, taxes, and inspections for honest sailors, and more fatal consequences for pirates. Patrols, sentry towers, and defensive structures, that's your second layer. Then you make the third layer, the political obstacles. These ones don't affect the honest traders at all. Calling them political may be a stretch, but the pirates of these waters have different bases and different territories of their own. A pirate caught poaching is in deep trouble. The various catchments, their hunting grounds, their flagships and tributaries, their captains, that's your third layer. And then you make the fourth layer, the supernatural obstacles or the mysteries. I like to add mysteries on every level, but if you're creating a fantasy campaign or a story based on a sea like this one, it's always good to create an overarching mystery. The rift runs right through the Gold Hunter Sea, and while it runs beneath every path from one side to the other, there are only a few safe crossings. The rift itself, what lies beneath, what comes out of it, and why it's there, that's the last layer. And with all four layers, you have a complex world. It's not convoluted. If one of your layers encounters a writing problem, if there's a plot hole in one, it won't make the whole thing fall apart. Take it layer by layer and build it up and make the layers respond to one another. We've got our natural landmarks and their inherent risks. We've got some layered details on who lives where and what they want. Let's get into some more practical application of these details so that you can really make it work in action. The main thing to remember when you're doing this is the predator-prey perspective. There's a few details that I've added or will add to this map in order to make it usable to someone who wants to be a pirate in the Gold Hunter Sea. A great deal of that is the natural landscape and the political layout of the area. That's true. But a pirate will look for details amongst that big picture, and I have just the answer for that. In the balance of a society in which some folk are predators, i.e. pirates, and others are prey, i.e. merchants and the innocent, all arrangements have their pros and cons for both sides. A lonely settlement on the coast, far away from the normal patrols of the Imperial Navy, does not have to pay taxes, but it is a prime target for a raid. The trade route that stretches across the rift attempting to avoid the attention of the monsters beneath is much safer if you band your ships together and make the crossing in one place. But while that helps against the monsters, a pirate who knows about that arrangement can lay a devastating trap. Later on in this map, I'll be adding in some notes from the pirate who sketched their treasure directions into it. And amongst them is where is best to ambush merchant vessels, where is heavily guarded, and where you can resupply. A pirate's map does not only lead to the treasure that they already have, but to the treasure that they can yet take. So, let's go into that. We've had all sorts of cartographers' charts and sketches recently, from naturalists' maps to site-specific charts, and all of them have had a great deal of detail written into the margins for the reader to learn about the location in question. And while we've covered that in great length before, check out How to Draw a Stunning Handout Map for content additions from an official perspective, we're going to talk more about what a pirate or an adventurer would write on a map, and how you can incorporate it into your stories. An annotator will only add what details are relevant to them. Or, correction, they will only make a mess of a map once. The cardinal rule is that the map still has to be readable, but they will add in notes for themselves later on, sketching out the need to know and need to remember in case things ever slip their minds. Sketching them on a map means that they can directly link their notes to a location, and so it makes sense then that the notes themselves are all location specific. So, to that end, there are 4 kinds of location specific notes that a character can scribble on a map. First is myths. All sailors are superstitious. Now that's obviously a generalization, but I can personally understand it from a psychological perspective. As I mentioned before, a ship is at the mercy of practically every natural force, and it's only by pure skill and sheer dumb luck that they keep on floating, and accidents are generally very messy. So, to counteract that, sailors comfort themselves with superstitions, beliefs, and a complex mythology to keep their minds off the danger that surrounds them constantly. Note that the mind will automatically create explanations for occurrences even if there is no explanation obvious. For areas of danger that they do not understand the root cause of, they will create a mythological or a supernatural explanation. For example, a cold meltwater river coming from the mountains hits the warm tropical sea and causes near constant fog in its immediate vicinity. The fog makes the area unnavigable, and the rocks there are extremely treacherous. So the pirates avoid the area, claiming that the fog is the breath of a beast that lives at the mouth of the river and eats ships. The next is opportunities. These can be far less fantastical than the last category, but they are crucial nonetheless. Changing political systems, economic landscapes, and trade routes are all a core part of a pirate's life, and they need to take them into account. If a pirate captain hears a rumor that a port will be doubling its tariff for incoming merchant vessels, she needs to listen. Many merchant vessels then will be going elsewhere, and the port authorities will be gathering coin with a vengeance. Both of these facts are handy for a pirate. The next is risks. It's the other side of that coin. Wherever opportunity exists, so too does risk. Many of these risks will be marked out on a map already or be inherent to the landscape, but cartography is never as exact a science as the map makers would have you believe, particularly not for a profession so vulnerable to reefs. Risks such as rips, maelstroms, reefs, and rocks may not be marked on maps, but should definitely be included in notes. And experiences. Generally, every note that's handwritten on a map comes from a personal experience in some way. But this is the title heading for all of those notes that the pirate makes that aren't in the other 3. They're the clues leading to the treasure. They're the scribbles about their life before becoming a pirate. All of the world building that you want to add in. These are all about them as a character and not necessarily the world as it is. Which leads us neatly into the world building itself as it pertains to these notes. When you're creating a map, how do you add in notes that your characters will use to explore, explain, and extrapolate? As a cartographer, it almost physically pains me to encourage this, but don't be afraid to scribble on your maps. I mean, they're just maps. And not on my maps, obviously, on your own maps. So here are some different kinds of scribbles and scratches to include. The simplest kind of note, one of these just connects or highlights points. If you have a port of interest where they don't have tariffs, circle it. If you have a point that's excellent for ambushing merchants, put a cross on it. If you know that one of the kingdoms has just invaded a border town on the coast, add in an arrow. And the best part is just adding these basic shapes doesn't give the reader an explanation. It's ambiguous, so you have a playable mystery there. Short form clarifications are for single word or numerical additions. If there's a port, maybe you can mark the tariff. If there's a trade route, maybe mark the passage cost, but you can also mark the names of pirate captains in their hunting grounds, the real names of pirate strongholds, or passwords to enter secret places. The long form marginals are the ones from above. These are the full sentences, and they contain detailed explanations crammed into the blank spaces or the margins of a map to record insights. These are the most obvious, but the more detailed the explanation, the less work that your characters need to do. Don't make it too easy on them. Now, I know that this is a map-making channel, and it's not a writing channel. It's astonishing, frankly, how often those two coincide. Map-making is, after all, an expression of world building, and world building requires a lot of writing to make it work. But when you're using a map and its scribbles to explore a character, it's important to note that the work involved isn't map making, it's writing. Which isn't to say that I don't have any advice for you. I've done it for my own maps and others before, but just to warn you. So here's the step-by-step to adding a backstory and plot point to the map. Step 1. Timeline your backstory. Stick it all down on the page in order. You don't need my help with the timeline. You know what you're doing. Step 2. Locate each plot point. For each major event or circumstance, put in exactly where it happened. If it happened over a wide area, find the major 3 or 4 concentrations of its consequences or its inception and just record those. Step 3. Record a short response for each. Now, from the character that's doing the scribbling, write down what their response would be. Somewhere between 2 to 8 words. It could range from something as ambiguous as "the worst day of my life" or "never again" to something more explicit. "This is where the world ended." Step 4. Add to the map on the locations specified. Nice and simple, just combine all your ingredients and bake it for half an hour. Alright, let's get into the actual details that you will need to add to the pirate maps that you create and that I haven't necessarily given much attention to so far. I haven't been doing this very much for previous videos, but as I'll go through, I'll start to update the format of the video so that you can have a comprehensive list of additions to make them much more immersive. All maps require their readers to be able to use them to navigate, and so in this map, as all maps, we need to include a compass rose, a distance grid, which is generally a line north-south and measured to correspond to a measurable distance, a scale, and any legend that you need. Note that for the legend, you don't need one if the map is self-explanatory. If it's obvious that a mountain is a mountain or all the peaks are labeled mountains, then you don't need a separate textbook explaining that to the reader. If they can't get that from context, they kind of deserve to get lost. If you do have a more complicated map, then you will need a legend. If you have symbols that aren't all labeled explicitly, or if you have variations that need to be noted in the kinds of cities, the forests, or the sites, then you should ink out a legend and show the reader what they all mean. That being said, I like to mix things up occasionally by including an ambiguously named and mysteriously symbolized points on my map, so there's an element of intrigue for my players to encounter, but that's just me. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. All maps tell a story. Generally, that story is a very sedate one. It's the story of mountain ranges and forests and rivers. It's the story of the way that the world turns, where it rains, where the roads run. But you're in an enviable position. You can make your maps tell the larger strokes of a much more exciting story. The stories that maps tell are always on scales beyond the notice of the average person. No one person can look at a mountain range and truly know its story or the implications therein. So when you make a map and you have a large story to tell, the map can tell the physical parts of that story, the locations, the millennia of changes, and the scale beyond mortal ken. Okay, here comes the exciting bit. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a new format for our tutorials here at the Red Quills. Our videos are going to be the same, but seeing as everyone's had such an interest in the end product, and by the way, you can download this map in its A2 version through the link in the description below, we thought that it would give some examples for how to incorporate world building and use the maps by making a connected story between them. So this is the first of 6 tutorials that will be connected into a quest for the Pirate King's treasure. Now, to that end, I'll be releasing a lore video specifically about the Gold Hunter Sea and this map in a few days' time. I'll link it when it's released, and you can use that if you want to play within this area and follow along with the maps that I'll be creating for this quest. But this map is the beginning of the quest. Your players can find it clutched in the hands of a weary and wounded sailor, desperately trying to escape, while the map itself appears to be nothing more than a merchant's map covered in scribbles and scrawls to the uninitiated eye. On the back is a longer account. An explorer in the Gold Hunter Sea was captured by the dreaded pirate Amador Smoke-Eye, the man they called the Pirate King. He was forced to make the maps and lead Amador to a stronghold that the Pirate King would be able to use to store the treasures from a lifetime of plunder, and the map that your players find contains the clues to sail directly there. The full text of the explorer's account will be in the lore video entitled The Gold Hunter Seas, and the next video will be a tutorial about creating fantasy cities for your world building, in which we'll explore the first stop on the way to Smoke-Eye's treasure, the City of Ships. As always, I cannot thank everyone enough for the support that you all give us here at the Red Quills. We're very happy to be making these videos, so like and share these videos to help us build our fan base. We're improving on our videos all the time too. You can tell if you look at our older stuff, there's a definite increase in quality. So it's going to get better and better all the time. Comment below if you have any specific questions. I try to give the basics in the videos, but there's obviously so much to cover and a limited time to talk about it in, so I'm happy to discuss points in the comments to clarify any questions. Until next time then, enjoy your adventures.